Hello, everyone. Welcome to the seventh episode of Dollar Dialogue. Today, we're here to talk about a very important topic and a very interesting topic. As you have may seen from our video title, we're going to talk about the big brothers and their economies. And this is going to be part one of hopefully a mini series episodes that we're going to talk about and focus on big brothers and economies. And today, we're going to focus on Park Chung Hee, Teodoro Nguema and Robert Mugabe. I might be saying some of the names wrong, so my apologies for that in advance. And as usual, we have our host Shazib Karim and Arif Malik, and we have a very special guest speaker here with us today, Uzayr Eskander. Uzayr is a very dedicated student at our school AISD. He's currently in grade 10, and Uzayr is also very fascinated and very interested in learning about economies, about global economies, about learning about history. But to be specific, Uzayr loves studying past political leaders, even current political leaders, and he likes to see how they run their country and how they influence the economy of their country. That's why we are very excited to have Uzayr Eskander here today. And Uzayr, as I've said, he's a very dedicated student. Next year, when as our school offers economics courses from grade 11, he's going to take economics courses, and I hope that he's going to learn a lot from Mr. Spivey. And Uzayr is a very interesting guy. I hope that he would be able to add to our discussion today with our usual host. Uzayr, is there anything you would like to add to the introduction that I've just said?
Hello, as Araf introduced, I'm Uzayr Eskander. I'm very honored to be a guest speaker on the podcast. And as Araf said, I'm very interested in political studies and how they have to deal with economics, as I've been raised in a very political family, as many of my family members have a background in politics. And I'm very excited to be discussing this topic today.
Thank you, Uzayr, for your introduction. Now let's move on to our topic of discussion for today, Big Brothers. Now, some of you might be wondering, what does Big Brothers mean? So I'm going to read to you the official definition that I was able to find from Google. And the official definition for Big Brothers is that it's a person or organization exercising total control over people's life. And the reason we chose the name Big Brother instead of the word dictator, because dictator has a very negative connotation and we don't want to seem biased. That's why we chose a word like Big Brother, which is at one point highlight that these are people who exercised a lot of power over their country and hence their economies. But at the same time, we want to seem unbiased, and we don't want to seem like we don't like these people. We want to seem that we are unbiased and we are able to offer our most unbiased opinions on these issues. And now moving on, as I've said that we're going to talk about Big Brothers, and the reason we chose the name Big Brothers instead of other names such as dictators. I will also want to talk about that we're going to try to offer our most unbiased opinions that we can, because some of these leaders, not for today's episode, I think, but some of the leaders that we are going to talk about in future episodes in the series Big Brothers and Economies might have to do with our with the Bangladeshi culture, and some leaders might even have they might be respected in Bangladeshi culture. So for this reason, we will try to be as unbiased as possible. And now let's move on right into the topic of discussion for today: Big Brothers and economies, and the three big brothers that we're gonna focus on. Big brothers meaning a person who has a very tight or a very tight control over their country and hence their economies. The first big brother that I want to talk about is Park Chung Hee, and we're gonna go one by one and discuss the big brothers and how they ran their economy. So the first one up is Park Chung Hee. Now I would like to give you a brief introduction about Park Chung Hee. So Park Chung Hee was a South Korean military official who ruled South Korea from 1961 until his assassination in 1979, and he was a very pivotal figure in South Korea's history, and his leadership is often credited with the dramatic transformation of South Korea from a poverty-stricken post-war World War II nation to a economic powerhouse. And that's a very, I would say, positive economic impact of his rule, Park Chung Hee. And I would also like to add another thing before we move on. Some of these leaders might not have practiced democracy. They might have, silence, public freedom. They might have silenced personal freedom. They might have silenced journalists. So we would try to ignore all of those, because that's not our scope of discussion, we're going to try to only focus about the public leaders, about the political leaders, about the big brothers, and how they ran the economies. We're just going to focus on the economies. So even I might be saying positive things, I might be saying things that might sound positive, but the reason I would be saying is because they ran their economies in this way. And I do not, or any of our guest speakers or any of our hosts do not endorse the way they ran their country. And that's it. Let's move right on. So some of the economic policies that Park Chung-hee implemented was that his most significant economic strategy was the promotion of export driven industrialization. And he believed that South Korea needed to develop large manufacturing sectors to produce goods for export, which led to the prioritization of industries such as steel, electronics, and automobiles. And another thing that Park Chung-hee did is that he established chaebols. So some of you might know what chaebols are if you are familiar with how Korea works, but some of you might not. So basically, chaebol is a rich business family in Korea, and I believe that it translates to someone who's rich and belongs to a rich business family. So basically, what Park Chung did was that he supported the growth of chaebols, which are large family-owned conglomerates, as I've said before, and that were backed by the government through subsidies, incentives, and exclusive licenses. And for this reason, companies like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG, which are obviously global giants today, were nurtured in this era, receiving substantial support to enhance their competitiveness in international markets. So the most important thing that I realized that Park Chung did, which was very unique to Korea and to him, to probably all the leaders that ran the country, is how he emphasize the growth of private companies. And I don't think he handpicked, but he basically chose companies that he believed were likely to grow, and he helped them like through giving the government subsidy on all those things to grow, so that they were able to employ a lot of Koreans and make Korea rich. And for this reason, some of the most famous Korean companies that we know today are were during from his era, like Samsung, Honda, and LG. Are there anything that our host or Shazib and our guest speaker Uzay, would you like to add anything to the information that I just said?
Yeah, Araf. I'd say that, like, to add on to what you said and to talk about more about the economic policies that he implemented. Like, as we know, that Park is often credited with South Korea's economic miracle, and so if you look at some of the key economic policies he implemented, we'd see that he had heavy industry and and a chemical industry drive, because Park prioritized the development of heavy industries such as steel, shipbuilding, and petrochemicals. And if we look at the implementation, the government provided substantial financial support, including subsidies and low interest loans to key industries. And the impact of this was that this policy transformed South Korea into a major industrial hub with companies like POSCO, which stands for Pohang Iron and Steel Company, and Hyundai, which you all know, the car company. They became global players. And also, if we look at the infrastructure development that he implemented, it'd be that, like, if we look at the policy, significant investments were made in building the necessary infrastructure to support industrial growth. And the implementation of this was that the projects included the construction of highways, ports, and energy facilities. And this had a major impact as it improved infrastructure and it facilitated efficient production and transportation, further boosting the economic growth. Like, now that I've said this, like, I know that Uzayr, my friend Uzayr, he's visited Korea many times and he went this summer as well. So, Uzi, I have a question for you. Like, having visited Korea, Uzayr, what are some of the most striking examples of infrastructure or industrial projects that you saw, which can be directly linked to Park Chung-hee's economic policies?
So, as Araf said, during Park Chung-hee's rule over Korea, his main source of income growth was using chaebols, which were these large family-owned businesses that were aimed to increase the wealth of South Korea as a whole. And through this, as Araf said, there are many recognizable countries today, such as Samsung, and I would like to highlight Samsung, which is a very key company in Korea's growth. And as Shazab said, I've been to Korea. And in Korea, Samsung is obviously a very big conglomerate. And something else that I would like to highlight is during Park Chung-hee's rule, he emphasized the independence of Korea as an economy, and tried to stray away from a dependence which Korea had as coming from a war-torn country. Of course, they had they were backed up by America, and they had a bunch of resources from there. So in 1965, I believe, Park Chung-hee traveled to Washington, the capital of America, and asked the Americans for developmental loans to further establish his own country, as they were very poor at the time, with a GDP per capita of 100. I'm pretty sure, and they could barely live off this. So Park Chung-hee's plan was to use these American wealth to increase the GDP of Korea for a better life for his citizens. And he did this by using his 5-year economic development plans, which took part in many stages. And these slowly increased the GDP of the country. And due to that, there was a economic growth that people normally refer to as the miracle on Han River, and it increased the GDP of the country exponentially.
Thank you, Uzair, for your personal anecdotes over here. I would completely agree with you here. So, his leadership, because truth be said, unlike the leaders of North Korea, Park Chung Hee actually cared about the people and helped South Korea, and laid the foundation for South Korea's remarkable economic transition. So one of the things that Jaiho said to me was the economic development plans that Uzayr has mentioned. So yeah, he initiated a series of 5-year economic plans in 1962, and this helped Korea modernize in sectors of textiles, steels, chemicals, which helped to diversify the nation's agrarian economy. On top of that, Park's government promoted export-oriented industrialization, a strategic shift from the import substitution industrialization that many developing countries were pursuing at the time. And this is evidenced by the fact that by 1979, exports had increased dramatically from 33 million in 1961 to approximately $10 billion, which shows that under Park's leadership, South Korea actually saw economic development. Also, one of the key metrics that we use is the GDP per capita. And in 1961, it was $82 in South Korea. By 1979, it was well over $1,500. So this shows that there was also GDP growth on top of the significant development that there was under Park's leadership. And with that being said, I had a question for Uzayr. So Uzayr is obviously he's very knowledgeable about the political studies. So my question to Uzayr is Uzayr, do you think that Park Chung Hee's authoritarian approach to governance outweighs his authoritarian approach is outweighs the economic growth, or do you think one is more significant than the other, Uzayr? So
I would
I think what you are asking is that whether Park Chung-hee's style of rule, which is using suppression of political freedom and journalists, is it worth the economic growth of South Korea? I believe that's the question you're asking, right?
Yes, that is precisely the question I'm asking, Araf.
Okay.
I would say that we should not undermine political suppression, but in this scenario where Korea came from many very tough times, such as the Korean War and the Japanese colonization, I think the extreme methods were necessary to see success during these times. As I mentioned before, the Korean GDP per capita was very low, averaging 30 cents per day, which is obviously unlivable. So Park Chung-hee had to obviously make some very tough decisions, and these could be seen as immoral by some, but for me, I would say that they were necessary for the development of the country. And one of the examples of this would be Park Chung-hee's very controversial decision to open trade routes with their previous colonizer, Japan, and the people frowned upon this, as the Japanese treated them like inferior subjects during the time. And Park Chung-hee's decision to decision to trade with them made a lot of citizens angry. And along with this, he also tried to increase relations with many countries just to increase the GDP as a whole for better lives for the people. So, to conclude my statement, I would like to say that I do think it was justified as to escape the depths of the economy that they were buried into by their unfortunate circumstances. I think extreme measures needed to be taken.
Thank you, Uzayr, for your opinion. And again, I would like to highlight that we don't endorse any dictatorial rule. We don't endorse suppression of political freedom or journalists. But as we evidence shows, Park Chung-hee's rule obviously led to the growth of Korean economy, and for this reason, we believe that his rule, as Uzayr has stated, was able to grow Korean's economy, and for this reason, I think that to some extent we should overlook the political suppression that he did, because at the end of the day, Korean people came from Korean people were starving before his rule, and after his rule, they came as a strong, powerful economic powerhouse. So now let me, so basically, based on our discussion, what I am hearing is that his Park Chung-hee's role in South Korea's economy was very positive, and I would like to sum up or like go over the points that all of our hosts and guest speakers have said. For example, like starting in 1962, Park Chung-hee initiated a series of 5-year plans, and the first plan also obviously focused on building economic infrastructure and promoting industries that would increase exports. And the plan also, as I believe some of you have highlighted, emphasized sectors such as textile, electronics, and steel. And this strategy aimed to transition the economy from being agricultural based to one that is industrial and service oriented. Moreover, as I think Shazib, Arif, and Uza have highlighted, during the third and fourth 5-year plans, the focus shifted towards heavy industries like chemicals, steel, shipbuilding, and automobile manufacturing. And this obviously helped South Korea, develop as an industrial base that became pivotal in its export-driven growth model. And obviously, Park Chung-hee's government provided various incentives for exports, including tax benefits, financial supports, and exclusive export zones to companies in Korea, such as Samsung and Hyundai. And this obviously boosted South Korea's exports. And in fact, the exports grew from around $55 million in 1961. I would like to emphasize $55 million in 1961 to over 17 billion by the end of 1979. That's a substantial growth. That's not just substantial, that's exponential. That's So that highlights that his role obviously in the economy was very positive. And the chaebols and the large family owned conglomerates received considerable support under Park's regime, which included easy access to credit and protection from imports. And companies like Hyundai, Samsung, and LG were nurtured to become giants in their respective industry that obviously contributed to the national economy. And there was significant investment made in education, particularly in science and technology, to meet the needs of the industrial sector. In fact, the literacy rate improved from 71% in 1960s to around 88% by the late 1970s. And obviously, the economy grew, as all of you have highlighted. The economic GDP per capita in Park Chung-hee's start in 1961 was around $82, and at the end of his rule in 1979, it was around $1,600. And the economic annual growth rate was average around, like, I think 9 to 10%, placing Korea among the fastest growing economy during that period. And obviously, the industrial output grew at an average rate of around 25% during the late 1960s and 80s. And this is a very important thing. The share of manufacturing in GDP increased from 14% in 1962 to 25% in 1980, while the agriculture sector decreased from 37 to 15% in the same period, reflecting that the Korean economy was becoming industrialized. And employment in the industries grew, reducing the unemployment obviously significantly and moving portions of the population into middle class status. And by the end of Park's tenure in 1979, when he was assassinated, South Korea had transformed its trade deficit into surplus. The country's exports increased substantially, with trade surplus helping to accumulate foreign exchange reserves. And I think, and the final point that I would like to say before moving on, is that urbanization rate increased as people moved to cities for industrial jobs. And the urban population grew from 28% in 1960 to, I think, over 48% by 1980. And the industrial development obviously improved living conditions, with significant advancement in housing, roads, and public services. So these are all the positive things that Park's role as a big brother had on his economy in South Korea. Now, all of these roles are obviously, all of this impacts, all of these implications of his role in South Korea's economy are obviously very, very positive. But right now, I would like to talk about something that's not positive about about the effects of South Korean economy because of his role, which is the establishment of support of chaebols in South Korea. I believe that chaebols possess a lot of power, and for this reason they're able to control a lot of things in the country, and sometimes they sometimes commit crimes and get away with it because of the amount of power they had. So are there any negative impacts of South Korea's economy as a result of Park Chung-hee's negative impacts of South Korea's economy as a result of Park Chung, not economy, but in South Korea as a result of Park Chung-hee's rule, because of all of the things that he did for his economy was always positive. But are there any negative impacts of his rule in South Korea that you would
Around
like to
the
talk
fact
about?
that yeah, so you mentioned about Chaebol. So in fact, before coming to this podcast, I talked to Junho Lee. You may know him. He's also from South Korea, and he shared insights to me about Chaebols. So as you mentioned, Chaebols are like the rich family or the financial clique who own South Korean conglomerates and control a large part of the economy. So one thing Junho mentioned to me was the fact that like there's a huge income like inequality in South Korea, and a great and the fact that while there was under Park's rule, while rapid industrial growth did increase the general prosperity of the nation, it also led to uneven wealth distribution and accompanied industrialization during Park's regime resulted in a large population moving to cities, often outstripping the urban infrastructure's capacity to cope. And this ultimately led to people living in more horrific conditions. And additionally, on top of that, there was also questionable labor conditions. The economic boom was partly achieved at the expense of labor conditions. Workers' rights were often suppressed, and labor unions were tightly controlled under Park's regime, often leading to low wages and long working hours. And we also touched base on this in history class by Mr. Spivey when we talked about industrialization in England, when similar stuff occurred, when rapid urbanization led to lower wages and ultimately led to people actually having worse lives than when they were in an agrarian society. And yeah, these are some of the negative impacts during Park's regime. So Shazib or Uzair, would you like to add anything to that?
I would like to add a statement. As you mentioned, our good friend Junho Lee uh, is very knowledgeable about Korea, and as I went with him to Korea, I could see the clear impact that chaebols have over Korea. So as I saw the country, I saw the main chaebols being Samsung, LG, and Lotte specifically, and I think the negative impacts that these chaebols can have is by limiting the job occupations in Korea. As we know, in Korea, there's a heavy emphasis on studying in school, studying to get a good job. And as these kids study, they normally study hard to enter one of these bigger chaebols, as they have much higher paying wages compared to other places. So I would say that this system put in by Park Chung Hee would limit the amount of opportunities for jobs by limiting them to stay in these chaebols. Now, Shazib, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, very good point. And to add on to what you said, Araf, what the question to add on to what question you had on the negative impacts of his rule on South Korea, I'd say that while Park Jung-hee's economic policies were successful, they did come with some significant social and political costs, because I'd say that Park's regime was highly authoritarian, and political dissent was heavily suppressed. And as we know, I'm pretty sure Arib, you probably know a lot about this as we were discussing this. The Yushin Constitution of 1972, it basically granted Park virtually unlimited power, allowing him to rule by decree and significantly extending his presidential term. This created a quasi dictatorial regime where opposition was not tolerated. The government maintained strict control over the media, and political opponents were frequently targeted. and many were imprisoned, tortured, or even executed. And this oppressive environment, it stifled the democratic development and created a climate of fear among the populace.
Shazib, I would completely agree with you there pertaining the human rights that you have mentioned. And also, while you were talking, one thing came to my mind as well. So, Jiho was also talking to me about the high level of debt that South Korea has. And while researching, I found out that South Korea's foreign debt had surged to alarming levels during Park's regime, from a mere $200 million in 1962. The foreign debt grew to approximately $47 billion by 1980, and this rapid accumulation made South Korea one of the most heavily indebted countries in the world at the time. And when you and like we talked about this with Mr. Spivey, I think once, when you like, debt isn't necessarily bad, but when you have a lot of debt that a country relies upon, it can cause the country to be economically vulnerable, and also economically vulnerable, and also when and on top of that, it can also lead to financial crisis. So other than the economic debt that South Korea had, there was also one more issue that Jiho also mentioned to me, and it was the fact that the influx of foreign capital had also contributed to high inflation rates. During the 1970s, South Korea experienced periods of double-digit inflation, which peaked at over 20% annually in some years. And this inflation eroded the real wages and impacting the standard of living for the average South Korean. So as you so this clearly shows that while the economy was growing, the wealth disparity persisted, and there was also a huge surplus of foreign debt, which caused the economy to inflate as well. So, Uzayr, you were talking to me about the inflation as well. So, would you like to have any comments on the high inflation that eroded the standard of living for many South Koreans, despite the country economically prospering?
So the heavy inflation that plagued the country can be attributed to the war and the events of the war. So as Park Chung Hee as Park Chung Hee decided to take many loans from America, as they were a dependent economy, and Park wanted to change that, obviously, for the betterment of his country, so that they could have a economic uprising. He took many loans, and these loans increased the inflation of the economy. And along with that, I would also like to bring back the topic of the chaebols, as I think this is the cornerstone of the economy still, and I would like to talk about the heavy impact that it had on current Korean society. These chaebols have a massive impact that I cannot begin to like fully describe with words. These chaebols like control the whole country, and this could be seen as a very, very negative thing, as if any financial trouble were to occur within these chaebols, it could have widespread repercussions on the entire national economy, as these chaebols control the entire economy and the ecosystem of it. So I would like to pass the conversation on to anyone who's willing to speak.
Uh, yeah, Uzair, that was a good point. And adding on to your point and to the question that Ari brought up, Arib, like your question about the high inflation rate under his rule, I'd say that the that high inflation was a significant issue during Park Chung Hee's rule, particularly in the early years of his economic reforms, because the rapid industrialization and aggressive economic policies led to substantial inflationary pressures. The government's heavy investment in infrastructure and industrial projects, combined with an emphasis on export led growth, increased the money supply and demand for goods and services, pushing the prices up. And the high inflation had several impacts on the economy. Like, just to name a few, it'd be the cost of living, as the rising prices eroded the purchasing power of ordinary citizens, increasing the cost of living, and also the wage pressure, because and to look at the wage pressure, like to cope with the rising cost of living, workers demanded higher wages, leading to wage inflation as well, and also government pressures. Like, because in response to these inflationary pressures, the government implemented various measures such as tightening monetary policy and controlling wages and stabilizing prices of essential goods. However, these measures sometimes led to social unrest as workers and businesses adjusted to new regulations. Also, to add on and like to highlight another point, I remember, I think Arib, me, you, and like I think Uzayr was also there, Jiho were there. Like we were also discussing this maybe in history class. Arib, I don't know if you can recall this when we were talking about the human right abuses under Park Chung Hee's rule. Like the human right abuses were uncontrolled during Park's regime, because like if you look at it, the KCIA played a central role in monitoring, intimidating, and punishing political dissidents and perceived threats to the regime. Surveillance was widespread, and arbitrary detentions were common. Torture and other forms of punishments were used to extract confessions and suppress opposition. And these abuses undermined the rule of law and violated basic human rights, creating a society where fear and repression were tools of governance.
Opinions that have been shared now. So, from because we have limited amount of time, we would like to now move on to our second big brother. But to sum up the information that we were able to gather about the first big brother and discussion that we had about it. So, what I understand is that Park Chung-hee, even he obviously had a lot of positive impact for South Korea's economy, but despite that, his leadership of it led to the growth of chaebols, which obviously have a high degree of control over Korea, which is something that's not good. Of a few families controlling a country, so that's the sum of his rule. And there were some techniques that he did that were there were techniques that he did that were questionable politically and ethically, but as a whole, he had a very positive impact in South Korea's economy. He was able to make South Korea from a relatively poor economy to a very high income economic powerhouse in the world. Now, moving on to our second big brother for today, Teodoro Obiang. So Teodoro Obiang Nguema has been the president of Equatorial Guinea since 1979, and after seizing power in the coup d'état, and his tenure has been marked by significant economic changes due to discovery and exploitation of substantial oil reserves in 1990s. However, his rule has also been criticized for widespread corruption and poor economic management. For example, the economic policies that were implemented by Obiang includes the discovery of oil, as I've said first before, transforming. Not his economic policies, but the lack of the things that he didn't do after discovering oil was that he didn't diversify. That's a fair, like I would say something that he didn't do. He should have done. So moving on into talking about what he did for Equatorial Guinea. So the discovery of oil transferred Equatorial Guinea from one of the poorest countries in Africa to one of the highest GDP per capita income country in on the continent. However, the wealth generated from the oil has been tightly controlled by Obiang and his close associates, and for this reason, even though Equatorial Guinea has a very high GDP per income capita, most people in Equatorial Guinea are poor because the wealth, every single penny from the oil money goes usually to the president and his close associates. And as I've highlighted once, the limited diversification for of the Equatorial Guinea economy and the policies under Obiang have been largely focused on extracting and exporting crude oil, and there's been minimum investment on other sectors of economy, even in agriculture and manufacturing, which is why Equatorial Guinea remains one of the most underdeveloped countries in the world. And there has been significant investment in infrastructure in some areas of Equatorial Guinea, but it is criticized for being concentrated in areas that directly benefit the elite or are meant to showcase the country to foreign investors. And rural areas in Equatorial Guinea remain significantly underdeveloped. And also, Equatorial Guinea, as I've said before, experienced a rapid economic growth in the 1990s and due to oil production. And even though the GDP skyrocketed, this growth was not sustainable because the growth changed as the oil price fluctuated, and even though the economy grew, and that's quote unquote grew, the and even though the GDP per capita like grew a lot, the wealth gap in Equatorial Guinea is extreme. The majority of the population remains in poverty with little access to basic services like healthcare, clean water, and reliable electricity. And there has been a huge corruption in Equatorial Guinea, which revenues from oil reserve not being transferred enough, and this has led to acquisition of embezzlement and the misallocation of resources, hindering economic growth. And the case of Equatorial Guinea is a classic example of Dutch disease, where the focus on the lucrative export commodities such as oil leads to neglect of other sectors. And the influx of oil obviously has led to the appreciation of the Equatorial Guinea economy. And fiscal policy in Equatorial Guinea, talking about the economy, has been characterized by high spending on state-driven projects that often lack transparency and accountability. So, in short, what I'm trying to say is that the Big Brother Obiang's role in Equatorial Guinea economy was not positive, because even the Equatorial economy grew because of the uh, oil because of the oil production. The economy actually didn't grow because people still don't have access to pure pure necessities of life, such as how what access to clean water, household healthcare, housing, and those things. And so that's very unfortunate for Equatorial Guinea. And one thing that Equatorial Guinea has done has invested in a lot in infrastructure, but you have to first to understand Equatorial Guinea. You have to understand that Equatorial Guinea is divided in two parts. Equatorial Guinea, or the capital Malabo, I think that's what it's called. It's located in an island, while the majority of the country is located in mainland Africa. But most of the infrastructure projects were in the island of Malibo. I think that's what it's called. Malabo. Sorry, my apologies. Most of the infrastructure projects were in the capital of Malabo. So, and that's where the politicians live. That's where the president and his close associates live. So, all of the economic growth in the Equatorial Guinea is actually not going to the people, but it's actually going to his pockets. And so, obviously, there has been be any like significant growth in the economy, and there has been no infrastructure development. There has not been any development in the lives of the people living in Equatorial Guinea. So, are there anything that Shazib, Arif, or Uzay, would you like to add anything to the information that I've just said?
I would like to add some information about the rule of Obiang Neguma. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name. So
I
I would
believe, I believe it's called. I believe it's called Ninguema.
Nguema, okay, my apologies. So Nguema, throughout his rule of Equatorial Guinea, which was a very long span, he mainly decided to put all his assets into oil, and I would say that this is a very risky choice, as the saying that "don't put all your eggs into one basket" tells us that it's very risky to put everything into one facet of the economy, and this means that the whole economy is dependent on oil prices and the fluctuation of oil prices through different economies. So they're very dependent on the price of one resource, which I would say is very risky. And along with that, I think that uh, his like key eye for helping out his close associates over the public is a very common practice that can be used now. But I would still like to say that it's a practice that should not be looked up to or seen as very essential for a country, as it limits the growth of the people and the country, which I think inhibits the country to grow in a more proper and stable way for the future.
Uzair, I completely agree with you there. Like the fact that Equatorial Guinea's like majority of its GDP, I believe over 90% of its exports are dependent on oil, and 60% of its GDP is dependent on oil. So I completely agree with you here. Like I feel like the leader Nguema has completely in essence destroyed the economy, because like as you mentioned, he has put all of his eggs in one basket. Now and first of all, like oil is a very like it's very unsustainable, like in the long term it's not really sustainable, for which the economy is 100% gonna face challenges like many of the Middle Eastern countries. And the problem is like Equatorial Guinea isn't as developed, and there's no tourism sector unlike the Middle Eastern countries, for which there's a huge issue on oil dependency and lack of diversification. And other than that, I would also like to talk about some of the corruption that has reverberated in Equatorial Guinea. There's large scale embezzlement, particularly involving the president's family. I won't have to go far. The Nguema's own son has faced international sanctions, including travel bans and asset freezes, due to their involvement in high-end corruption and other malfeasances. And because of this, I feel like, even though, like, comparing to South Korea's leader Park, like, even though Park was an authoritarian leader, which is no doubt, he was an honest leader and he wasn't corrupt, unlike was the case for Equatorial Guinea. And because of this, I think Equatorial Guinea's economy in the long term is gonna suffer because of its lack of diversification. So would you guys agree with me here?
Yeah, Arif, I'd agree with you, Arif, and I'd also like to add on to what you've said. So basically, as we all know, like we said that the discovery of oil has had a profound impact on Equatorial Guinea's economy, and so I'd like to elaborate on how this has shaped the country's economic landscape. So if you look at it, the discovery of oil in the 19 I think it was the 1990s, I mean, led to a dramatic increase in government revenues and transformed Equatorial Guinea into a significant oil producer. And so, because of this, as we know, the country's GDP grew rapidly, and it now boasts one of the highest per capita incomes in Africa. However, the benefits of this oil wealth have been concentrated in the hands of the ruling elite, with little trickling down to the general population. So, if we like look at the economic mismanagement and corruption, as you guys have highlighted a bit as well, I'd also like to highlight it a bit more. So if you look at it, the economic mismanagement and corruption are uncontrolled under Obiang's regime, and the government's revenues from oil have not been effectively used to develop other sectors of the economy or improve public services. Instead, a large portion of this wealth has been siphoned off by the ruling elite. Transparency in International consistently ranks Equatorial Guinea among the most corrupt countries in the world. So I think that just says a lot on his regime.
So the overall implication or the overall summary of the information that we have discussed, and that I feel that we have discussed, is that the rule of Obiang in Equatorial Guinea has not positively impacted the economy, because he has concentrated a lot of his economic development, or so-called development, into his family, into himself. Even though the economy of Equatorial Guinea has grown from, I would like the GDP per capita of Equatorial Guinea is one of the highest in Africa. Despite that, people don't have access to water, people don't have access to basic housing infrastructure, basic healthcare. That's because all the wealth money of Equatorial Guinea is not going to the people, it's going to Obiang and his family and his close associates. So the overall implication of his rule in Equatorial Guinea is very negative, and the effects of his rule in Equatorial Guinea has been very negative, because all of the oil wealth is not going to the people, and that's one thing. And second thing, he has not diversified Equatorial Guinea at all, the Equatorial Guinea economy at all, because he's only focusing on extracting oil and making money off it. He doesn't care about other sectors, which is very unsustainable, because in the future oil might not exist in Equatorial Guinea, and that's gonna be the time where Equatorial Guinea's economy would be collapsed. And now people, normal people in Equatorial Guinea don't have basic water, basic housing, basic healthcare, and if that happens, they're not gonna have anything. They're gonna starve. So that's a very unfortunate impact. Now let's moving on to a very colorful person, I would say, Robert Mugabe, and that's our final big brother for today. Robert Mugabe served as the Prime Minister of Zimbabwe from 1980 to 1987, and then as President from 1987 until his resignation in 2017. And his tenure was characterized by initial optimism and subsequent economic decline, marked by severe hyperinflation, massive unemployment, and a collapse in public services. So some of the colorful things that this colorful man did was that one of the most controversial policies was the land reform program initiated in the late 1990s, which involved the forceful redistribution of land from white farmers to black Zimbabwean farmers without compensation. And this policy was intended as a correction of colonial land imbalances, but was poorly executed and led to the dramatic drop in agriculture activity. And then he also had the indigenization laws, and I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but I think it's indigenization laws. And he implemented those laws that required locals own at least 51% of all businesses. And this policy was meant to empower black Zimbabweans economically, but often deter foreign investment and stifle economic growth due to perceived risk and instability. Because even though if you might own a business in Zimbabwe, that business won't be yours because 51% will be owned by a Zimbabwean, even though you do all the work. And Mugabe's government is widely criticized for its economic mismanagement and corruption and high levels of government expenditure on the public sector, coupled with the reduced foreign investment and reducing economic output, created a fiscal imbalance that was often managed through the printing of money. And now let's come talking about money. There was hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, and the most infamous economic consequence of Mugabe's policy was hyperinflation, which peaked in 2008 and 9. The government's excessive printing of money led to finance deficits, and combined with the shrinking economy, led to inflation rates that reached astronomical levels, rendering most Zimbabwean dollars worthless and necessitating transaction in foreign currencies. And the land distribution, obviously, in Zimbabwe severely disrupted the agriculture sector that was once the backbone of Zimbabwe's economy. The lack of experience, resources, and support for the new black farmers contributed to a significant decline in agriculture output, and this in turn affected the industrial sector that depended on agriculture, leading to widespread industrial closure and job losses. And there was obviously high unemployment during his era. Unemployment soared as the economy contracted and the informal job market collapsed. This situation forced a large portion of the population into informal employment and poverty, and the public health and education sectors, once among the best in Africa and Zimbabwe, deteriorated significantly under economic strain. And there were also supply shock issues in his rule. And the Land Reform Act, as I've said, acted as a negative supply shock, which decreased the productive capacity of the economy. And a rapid decline in agriculture output reduced not only food production but also foreign exchange earnings from agriculture exports, increasing food insecurity and economic vulnerability. And there were also fiscal irresponsibilities in Zimbabwe. Mugabe's rule, which were characterized by overspending and poor fiscal management, combined with reckless monetary policy, including printing money, which led to overinflation. And Mugabe's rule in Zimbabwe obviously showed what happens when a colorful guy like him runs a country. The lack of clear economic policies, coupled with political instability, led to sustained economic regression and a decrease in standard of living that Zimbabwe is probably suffering still now. Are there any information or anything that Shazib, Arif, or Uzayr you would like to add to the information that I just said?
So I would like to start the conversation off, and I would like to say that Mugabe, although we can see that his efforts may not have been the most successful, at the beginning we can say he had unrealistic expectations of helping the black Zimbabweans increase their wages, but maybe we can say that he took it too far. And due to this, as Ari mentioned before as well in the topic of Korea, inflation took place, and this hyperinflation sort of collapsed the economy, as we can see by the infamous $1 trillion notes that weren't even enough to buy loaves of bread for the citizens of the country, and would overall be a negative. And unlike Park, who led a uprising in his economy and left the country at a good place for innovation in the future, and whereas Obiang is still currently ruling, so we can't make a conclusive impact, Mugabe left his country in a state of disarray due to his hyperinflation and his economic mismanagement, and left the country in a place that's very hard to recover for the Zimbabwean citizens. And I would like to pass the conversation on.
Yeah, Uzi, I'd agree with you, and that's a good point, Uzair, that you brought up. So if we also, like Uzair, you mentioned the early economic policies, right? So if you look at the early economic policies, I'd say that Mugabe initially had a positive impact on Zimbabwe's economy, and because in the early years of Mugabe's rule, Zimbabwe experienced relative economic stability and growth. Mugabe's government invested in education and healthcare, significantly improving literacy rates and access to medical services. And the agriculture sector, particularly commercial farming, was a strong contributor to the economy. However, these gains were short lived due to subsequent policy decisions and economic mismanagement. So, yeah, would you like to add anything?
Yes, Hazim, I completely agree with you and Uzayr over here. Like Mugabe has completely messed up the Zimbabwean economy. Like if I'm not mistaken, the inflation in Zimbabwe uh, has outnumbered the German inflation after World War I. So this really shows, if I'm not mistaken, by 2008, Zimbabwe experienced one of the most, if not the worst cases of hyperinflation in the history of this world, with an annual rate recorded at 89.76 trillion%, according to estimates. And this inflation was so severe that the Zimbabwean dollar was effectively worthless, leading to the abandonment of the currency in 2009. And according to another estimates, approximately during Mugabe's regime, the employment rate soared to 80%, which was one of the highest in the world. So this really shows that Mugabe, Zimbabwe, he has completely led Zimbabwe towards a treacherous path. The government has been spending exceeded revenue by large margins, fueled by corruption and mismanagement. And this fiscal imbalance has exacerbated the economic instability, and due to economic hardships as well, many millions of Zimbabweans have left the country, leading to a brain drain that further impacted the economic potential of this nation. And I would also like to talk about some of the agricultural output. The land reforms that Mugabe implemented not only disrupted the commercial farming sector but also diminished the food security in the country. Zimbabwe, which was all once known as the breadbasket of Africa, became a nation that was reliant on food aid from the UN. So this really shows that Mugabe's policies and governments was really detrimental to the Zimbabwean economy, and also because of his extreme corruption, which has completely destabilized the economy and the standard of living in Zimbabwe, which is truly horrible.
Yeah, that's very well said, and those are some interesting things that you said. And I really liked what you said. To add on to what you said about the hyperinflation, that was actually a really good point that you brought up. And as you already said, Arif, Zimbabwe is famous for experiencing one of the worst cases of hyperinflation in history. And as you said, the hyperinflation crisis, which peaked in 2008, I'd say that it was driven by several factors. And the first one would be the economic mismanagement, because Mugabe's government financed large budget deficits by printing money, leading to rampant inflation. And the collapse of productive sector would be another factor for the hyperinflation, because the decline in agricultural and industrial production reduced the supply of goods while demand remained high, pushing prices up dramatically. And also the unemployment and poverty. Hyperinflation disseminated savings and incomes, leading to skyrocketing unemployment and poverty. Basic goods became unaffordable for most Zimbabweans. And also the another point which Arif had already brought up about the currency devaluation, the Zimbabwean dollar rapidly lost value and confidence in the currency eroded. Like as Arif had previously said, the currency basically had no value anymore. And also another thing we could highlight is the political instability and corruption. So the political instability and corruption were rampant under Mugabe's rule, because the authoritarian governance. If you look at that, Mugabe's government was marked by many practices, including election rigging, a suppression of political opposition, and human rights abuses. This created an unstable political environment that discouraged investment and economic growth. And for the corruption, like the corruption permeated all levels of government and public services. Resources were often siphoned by the officials, reducing the funds available for public investments and services. This corruption undermined economic development and eroded public trust in institutions. And in response to the human rights abuses and political repression, international sanctions were imposed on Zimbabwe. And these sanctions further isolated the country economically and restricted access to international financial systems and markets. So, yeah.
I would
Thank
like
you.
to.
Yes,
Okay.
Uzayr, go on.
Okay, I would like to speak about his overall rule. So, from the beginning, you could kind of see Mugabe's intentions as he promised democracy when he was promoted to power, but over time, it slowly transitioned into a dictatorship, which I think would show his future aggressive means to ruling the country. And as as Arib clearly stated, his land reform movement was very aggressive, and he redistributed the land at a very aggressive rate, rushing it to the point where some farmers were rushed, and it led to the decline of the economy. As Arif said, the country was the breadbasket, and after it required assistance just to function for its people to eat well. But something that I think something Mugabe did do well, as opposed to the other big brothers we said, was I think he put his eggs metaphorically into many different baskets. He had his land reform, he had his mining sector, and he had a few other ways of economic growth, which the other leaders that we talked about did not have. And as to conclude, I would to conclude as saying a positive point, I would like to pass it on to Arib by asking him that do you think there are any positive points that that happened during Mugabe's rule, and do you think this could potentially outweigh the negative points that happened?
Please
Thank
make
you.
sure that all the points that you talk about are related to economics.
Yes, Araf. Yeah, and thank you, sir, for the question. Yes, so obviously, like we are like in history class, we have learned that we should always see the positive and negatives, so we can truly see the bigger picture here. And we talked a lot about negatives about Mugabe, but even though there was negatives, we should also yeah, I think there is some positives. Obviously, one of the thing that Mugabe did was under his leadership, education was there was a lot of education, and primary schooling fee was I think was free, so which resulted in a literacy rate that soared to over 90% by the late 1990s. So even today, many of the Zimbabwean people, like, they're fluent in English, and they're one of the leading African countries, I think maybe after South Africa and Kenya, who are fluent in English. So this shows that they're receiving a lot of education. And other than that, I would also say that healthcare wise, Mugabe also focused on giving the on serving the healthcare system to serve black Zimbabweans who had been marginalized under the colonial rule. So the land reform, obviously, which had many detrimental economic effects and was marred by violence and mismanagement. But its initial intention, I think, was not bad. It wanted to redress colonial land imbalances, and wanted to rectify the historical injustices that British had done in Colombia. So, oh yeah, Uzair, I would agree with you. Like, yeah, like at first, Mugabe's intention was to decolonize Zimbabwe from the British rule, and his intention, I feel, was pure. But somewhere along the way, he got caught up with the corruption and greed of power and money, which resulted in him messing up the Zimbabwean economy and leading to hyperinflation.
So I think the reason that the land reform thing that didn't work is because the people who were given the land, they were black Zimbabweans, and they didn't know how to run how to run farms and those things, because they were mostly people who probably came from low income households, who probably worked in, probably not in those farms, they probably worked in the cities or capital or somewhere else. And so for this reason, they had no idea of how to run a farm, and for this reason, I think that's the reason the farm project probably failed. Don't you think?
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I'd actually totally agree with you. That's a good point. And we basically like we were just discussing on his regime, and I think there's some lessons learned, right? So that's why I have a question for our guest speaker, Uzair. So, Uzair, my question to you is that looking back at Mugabe's legacy, like looking at his legacy, what lessons can other countries learn from Zimbabwe's experience under his rule in terms of balancing land reform, economic growth, and political stability?
I think something that people, especially leaders of other countries, can learn from Mugabe's approach to leading his country is to be more realistic with the political and economic spheres. As his main goal, he went straight in and tried to help the black Zimbabweans. But although this was a deep rooted problem, which I think he could have taken a slower attempt at dealing with, along with his economic facets. His land reform was very aggressive, and I think if he did it at a slower rate, then the hyper inflation of the country could have been avoided, as everything would not have had to be done at such a quick rate, and the people would not have had to demand for higher wages in order to compensate for the amount of work they were doing in such a short time.
So I think that will wrap up our discussion for today. And so the overall summary of our today's discussion is that the big brothers and the economies, the big brothers that we talked about, Park Chung Hee, his impact for the South Korean economy was positive, while the impact of the big brothers Obiang and Robert Mugabe's, their impact for Equatorial Guinea and Zimbabwe respectively were not positive economically. And I would like to thank Uzayr for coming up to, for his presence in this for his presence in today's discussion. And I really enjoyed talking with Uzai about the impact of big brothers, having big brothers such as Park Chung-hee, Obiang, and Robert Mugabe, and how they impact their country's economy. And Uzai, thank you very much for showing up today and for contributing positively to a discussion. Are there any final words that you would like to say before you leave?
I would like to say that I think being here is a very good experience to help me understand more of the economic intricacies that go into uh, controlling a country or even a sector of land. And I think this really helped me, and I think it will help me as I continue to move on to 11th grade and start my economics course.
Thank you, Uzar, very much for showing up today. I personally really enjoyed the discussion we had. And now that would be the end of our today's episode 7, which was about Big Brothers and Economics Part 1. We discussed about Park Chung-hee, Teodoro Nguema, and Robert Mugabe. And the overall summary of our discussion is that Park Chung-hee had a positive impact on South Korea's economy, while Obiang and Robert Mugabe had negative impact on Equatorial Guinea and Zimbabwe's economy, respectively. And that was the summary of our discussion. And I would like to thank the audience for listening to our discussion, for listening to our podcast recordings. And we hope to see you next week to discuss another interesting topic with another interesting guest speaker. And we hope to see you next week. That's the end of our discussion for today. Thank you so much for listening to our discussion today.